The barracks were always alive with noise. The sound of boots hitting the ground, warriors sharpening their weapons, the growls of predator cubs locked in their pens. It was not a place for peace, and it was never meant to be. The cubs were raised to become weapons, untamed, ruthless, and fierce. They were trained through harshness, fear, and loud commands, yet they never fully listened. Among all this chaos lived a human woman, kept not as a warrior but as a servant. Her work was simple but heavy, carrying water, cleaning, and tending to fires. No one in the barracks noticed her much. To the aliens, she was weak and unimportant, just another hand to keep the camp running. But while they overlooked her, the cubs did not. The cubs were restless every night. They clawed at the ground, barked sharp cries, and growled endlessly. The trainers grew frustrated, yelling, banging on cages, even trying force to silence them. Nothing worked. The cubs refused to rest. It was as if something deep inside them rejected the command of fear. One quiet night, the woman had finished her work. She sat in her small corner near the dim fire, too tired to think of anything else. She pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders and tried to close her eyes. That's when she heard it. A soft scratching sound, different from the usual clamor of the barracks. At first, she thought it was the wind dragging something across the wooden floor, but the sound came again, closer this time. When she turned her head, she froze. The cubs, the very predators that none of the warriors could control, were standing outside their enclosure. Their eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, their bodies tense, but they weren't attacking. They were watching her. Her heart pounded. She did not move, did not scream. The trainers often told stories about how dangerous the cubs were. They said the creatures would tear apart anything weaker than themselves. Yet here they were, padding softly across the floor until they stopped right in front of her. The warriors nearby noticed too. They laughed at first, whispering that maybe the cubs were waiting to strike, but the strike never came. The cubs simply stood there, breathing heavily, their eyes fixed on her as if waiting for something. Minutes passed. The woman, unsure of what to do, lowered her head to the ground and lay down on her side. Her work had exhausted her anyway, and she thought that perhaps if she pretended to rest, the cubs would leave her alone. But what happened next left everyone speechless. The moment she closed her eyes, the cubs shifted. They circled once, twice, and then curled up near her corner. Their restless pacing stopped. Their growls faded. One by one, they lowered their heads to the ground. And then, for the first time in weeks, the cubs slept. The barrack grew quiet in a way it never had before. The warriors stared, uncertain whether they were seeing truth or trick. These predators, who had snarled and fought through every command, now rested like gentle animals simply because a human servant had laid down near them. When morning came, the cubs stirred only after she did. As soon as she moved, they rose too, stretching and shaking their heads as if waking from the deepest sleep. The trainers barked orders, trying to take back control, but the cubs ignored them until she stood up. Only then did they return to their enclosure without protest. Whispers spread through the camp. Some said it was chance, nothing more. Others claimed the cubs were testing her before they attacked. But deep down, everyone had seen the truth. The cubs had chosen her presence over fear. That night, the pattern repeated. The woman sat in her corner, her blanket around her shoulders, her body weary from the day. And once again, the cubs gathered. They did not make a sound, only lay down around her. The trainers tried banging on the walls to break their focus, but nothing worked. The cubs would not sleep unless she slept. Days turned into weeks, and the strangeness became a quiet routine. No matter how restless the cubs were during the day, at night they always found their way to her corner. They refused to settle until she lay down. And once she did, silence filled the barracks. It was not force. It was not command. It was something else. something the warriors could not understand. The woman had no special training, no weapons, no authority. She had never tried to control the cubs. She simply allowed them near, and in return, they gave her something no one else could have imagined: their trust. The warriors grew uneasy. Some mocked the situation, saying it made no difference. But others watched carefully. They had spent years trying to bend the cubs to their will only to fail. Yet here was a fragile human, doing what they could not, without even trying. It was in those silent nights, when the fire burned low and the cubs slept around her, that the first cracks in the barracks' pride began to show. For the cubs had seen something in her no one else did. To them, she was not weakness, not prey, not a servant. She was safety. And though the warriors did not yet realize it, this simple act, the cubs refusing to rest without her, would be the start of a change. None of them could stop. The first night had been strange enough. No one in the barracks could explain why the cubs, beasts bred for war, wild in their very bones, had fallen asleep only after the human woman lay down. But when it happened again the following night, and then again the night after, whispers began to spread like fire through dry grass. The pattern was impossible to ignore. As the sun sank and the barracks dimmed, the cubs grew restless, pacing their enclosure with sharp growls and snapping jaws. Trainers tried their usual methods: harsh orders, banging iron rods against the walls, even tossing scraps of raw meat to distract them. But nothing worked. The cubs remained unsettled, their glowing eyes flicking toward the corner where the woman always sat. At first, she tried to avoid their gaze. She kept her head lowered, working quietly or folding the thin blanket she had been given. But no matter how much she ignored them, the cubs lingered, pressing against the bars, staring at her as if waiting. The guards, half amused and half uneasy, finally ordered her to lie down again, just to see if it would work. She hesitated, uncertain if she was being mocked or tested, but her body was weary from the day's work, and so she did as she had done before. She curled into her corner, closed her eyes, and let the weight of fatigue carry her. The result was the same. Almost instantly, the cubs settled. They circled, near their pen, then sank to the ground. Their growls faded into silence, their chests rising and falling in rhythm as they drifted into deep sleep. A hush fell over the barracks. The guards exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Some scoffed, saying it was coincidence. Others muttered that perhaps the woman carried some hidden trick, a secret scent or charm. But deep down, no one could deny what they saw. The cubs did not obey chains, did not heed commands, did not even respond to fear. Yet they listened to her stillness. The nights stretched on, and the same scene played out again and again. As the sky outside turned dark, the cubs would grow anxious. Their claws scraped against stone, their sharp cries echoed off the walls. And every time the woman would eventually surrender to her exhaustion, laying down in her small corner. Only then did peace return. Only then did the predators, creatures meant to terrify, become as quiet as lambs. The guards grew restless in their own way. They whispered among themselves when they thought she couldn't hear. They argued about whether this was a sign of weakness in the cubs or something far more dangerous. If the beasts had chosen her presence over the authority of their masters, what did it mean for the future of their training? What did it mean for the humans they sought to dominate? The woman herself remained uncertain. She had not sought this connection. She had not called the cubs, had not dared to reach for them, had not even spoken a word to them. And yet, they came to her. Their eyes, once sharp with threat, now looked at her with something else, something she couldn't quite name. At first, she thought it was simply exhaustion driving them. Perhaps they were too tired to fight once the night grew long. But as she watched them night after night, she noticed patterns. the cubs did not just collapse near her presence. They lingered, pressing their bodies close to the bars as though trying to be nearer. Sometimes, even after they had fallen asleep, a few of them would stir if she moved in her sleep. Their ears would flick, their eyes half open, until they saw her still resting. Then only then would they drift back into calm. The guards could not understand. They had seen trainers beaten and clawed for daring to stand too close. They had seen chains snapped, walls scratched deep by restless claws. Yet here was a woman with no weapon, no command, no strength, and the cubs chose her. Soon, the nightly ritual became something of a silent performance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the barracks grew quieter, waiting. The cubs would start their restless pacing, and the guards would shift nervously, muttering about the moment. And then, as if scripted, the woman would finally lay down, and the cubs would follow her into stillness. It was not only strange, it was unsettling. For the first time, the warriors saw control without dominance, obedience without force, and it had come not from strength, but from something so simple they had never valued it: patience. The woman began to notice a shift as well. In the mornings, when she rose, the cubs' eyes followed her closely. They did not growl as they once did. Instead, they stood still, waiting for her first movement. When she stretched her arms, they shook themselves awake. When she stepped away, they returned to their pacing, though less violently than before. It was as if her rhythm had become theirs. She wondered what they truly saw in her. Did they recognize kindness? Or perhaps they simply felt safe near her, the way children cling to the familiar. Whatever the reason, she could not deny the truth written plainly in their actions. They trusted her, in a way they trusted no one else. The guards whispered about it constantly. Some feared it meant the cubs were broken, ruined as weapons. Others feared the opposite, that the beasts were not broken at all, but were instead choosing their own leader. And if that leader was a human, what did it mean for the balance of power in the barracks? But while the warriors argued and speculated, the woman and the cubs simply continued their quiet exchange. She gave nothing but presence. They returned, nothing but peace. It was a bond built without words, without commands, without expectation. And yet, it was stronger than anything the barracks had seen before. Nights in the camp changed because of it. What had once been filled with snarls and clamor became nights of calm. Fires burned low without the constant threat of the cubs breaking loose. Warriors slept more deeply, though they did so uneasily, knowing the reason for that peace was not their power but hers. It was in those nights that the first true cracks in their pride began to show. For the cubs had made their choice clear. They did not choose chains, nor commands, nor fear. They chose her. And whether the warriors liked it or not, each night reminded them of the same unshakable truth. The human woman, who had never raised a hand in force, was the only one the cubs obeyed. The whispers began like faint winds, barely noticed at first, then growing stronger with each passing night. The warriors of the barracks, once unshakable in their pride and strict discipline, could not ignore the changes happening around them. The cubs, creatures once restless and wild, had become calm only in the presence of a human woman. And with their calm came something unexpected, peace that stretched beyond the enclosure, spreading to the entire camp. At first, the warriors mocked. They called it chance, coincidence, or weakness in the cubs. They are beasts, some argued. They only grow tired. Yet, deep down, they could not deny the truth. Each night followed the same rhythm. The cubs grew unsettled, pacing and growling, their sharp cries echoing through the barracks. But when the woman finally lay down, pulling the thin blanket over, her shoulders' silence returned like magic. The cubs curled into rest, and their stillness settled over everyone else like a quiet wave. It was impossible not to notice. The guards, who had once stayed tense and sleepless, now found themselves lowering their weapons when she lay down. Conversations that had once been loud and rough softened into whispers. Even the torches seemed less harsh, dimmed by instinct, rather than command. And without meaning to, the warriors began following the same rhythm as the cubs. Some resisted it. They clenched their jaws, determined not to let a human servant set the tone of their nights. They spoke louder on purpose, struck the walls with their fists, trying to prove they were in control. But their noise always drew sharp glances, not from the woman, but from the cubs. Yellow eyes would flick open, ears twitching, muscles tensing. And the warriors, hardened as they were, felt unease settle in their chests. So the noise died down. The strangest part was that the woman herself never asked for it. She did not speak to the warriors. She did not claim authority. She did not even look at them with challenge or pride. She was simply there, quiet, steady, her presence more powerful than any order barked by their leaders. The whispers began to take form in the barracks. Why her? Some asked. Why does she hold sway when our strength fails? It was not a question anyone wanted to answer, for the truth made them uneasy. The cubs did not obey chains or commands. They obeyed her stillness, her calm, her smile. The elders of the camp tried to explain it away. They said the cubs were confused, their instincts misled. It will pass, they claimed. They will grow and forget her. But even as they spoke, the nightly ritual continued, unbroken. Soon, even the most stubborn warriors found themselves adjusting. When the woman began preparing her small corner for sleep, they dimmed their torches without thinking. When she pulled the blanket over her shoulders, they lowered their voices. The once rowdy barracks, filled with clamor and boasting, transformed into a place of quiet respect at night. And none of it came from commands. It came from her. The woman noticed, though. She said nothing. She saw the way warriors who once looked at her with disdain now paused when she moved. She saw the way conversations hushed when she closed her eyes. She saw the flicker of confusion on their faces when they realized they were copying the cubs. Without even meaning to, it was not just obedience, it was reflection. The cubs mirrored her calm, and the warriors mirrored the cubs. And through this chain, the entire camp had begun to revolve around the quiet rhythm of a single human. Some grew unsettled by this realization. They whispered in the shadows, warning each other that it was dangerous. If beasts can be swayed by her silence, then so can men, they muttered. Others, however, began to wonder if it was strength of another kind. Not the strength of fists or teeth, but of presence. The kind of strength that asked for nothing, yet commanded everything. The woman herself never claimed it as power. She still thought of herself as small, fragile, and out of place in a world of sharp claws and sharper eyes. Yet she could not ignore what was happening. The cubs no longer growled at her. Instead, they sought her presence, their gazes softening when she walked past. The warriors no longer barked at her. Instead, they grew quieter, as though unwilling to disturb the peace she carried with her. By now, the whispers had grown too loud to be ignored. Around fires and along corridors, voices carried the same thought. She calms them. She calms us. It became a quiet truth in the camp. When she rested, so did the cubs. When the cubs rested, so did the barracks. And so, without orders or commands, the entire camp had fallen into her rhythm. Some warriors resisted to the very end. They clenched their fists at the idea that their lives, their nights, were shaped by a human servant. But even they could not deny the comfort of the silence. Even they found themselves lowering their voices when she closed her eyes, dimming their torches when she settled into sleep. And as the days passed, one truth became clear, whispered from soldier to soldier, echoing in uneasy hearts. She had achieved what none of them had, not through strength, not through fear, but through the quiet presence of peace. The human woman had not only calmed the cubs, she had calmed the entire barracks. The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into the bones and press down on the air. The barracks, normally filled with low murmurs and the restless movements of warriors, were unusually tense. The cubs had already gathered near the human woman, curling close to her corner as they always did, their sharp eyes soft whenever they glanced at her. But this night was different. The commanders had decided it was time for a test of authority. For too long, whispers had circled in the camp. Warriors questioned why cubs, meant to grow into fierce predators, would only rest when the human did. It unsettled them. It challenged their order. If loyalty could shift to her, even unintentionally, it could spread further. The commanders, proud and unwilling to admit doubt, resolved to prove that the cubs belonged to them, not to a fragile outsider. The test began with a sharp command. The heavy boots of warriors echoed through the barracks as they approached her corner. The cubs stiffened immediately, hackles raised, low growls rumbling in their throats. They pressed closer to her, their muscles tight, their bodies ready. The woman's heart quickened as she watched the scene unfold. But she did not move. She had learned long ago that stillness often spoke louder than action. The warriors reached down, attempting to pull the cubs away. What they expected was obedience. What they received was resistance. The cubs snarled, snapping their jaws, their teeth flashing in the torchlight. The sound echoed through the hall, primal and raw, shaking even the most hardened soldiers. The warriors shouted louder, yanking harder, but the cubs only dug their claws into the floor, refusing to be dragged away. The woman whispered nothing. She gave no orders, yet her calm eyes and steady breath seemed to anchor the cubs, strengthening their refusal. It was as though they drew their courage from her silence. The commanders grew frustrated. To lose to a handful of cubs was shameful. They barked for more men, ordering the cubs restrained. Rope was thrown, hands grabbed fur, but the cubs twisted and fought with a ferocity no one had expected. They did not cower. They did not submit. Their growls deepened, sharper now, their bodies striking against armored legs like storms against stone. One cub broke free, darting straight back to the woman's side, pressing against her legs with a whimper that sounded more like a plea. Another followed, then another, until the ropes were useless, the effort wasted. The barracks filled with chaos, shouts from warriors, snarls from cubs, and yet, in the middle of it, the woman remained still, her presence like a quiet flame in the storm. The commanders tried once more, shouting so loud the walls seemed to vibrate. But their words held no weight. The cubs' loyalty was unshaken. No force, no command, no threat could move them away from her. And then, in the midst of the shouting and growling, the woman did something simple. She lay down. Slowly, quietly, she lowered herself to her thin bedding, her blanket pulled lightly over her. The moment her head touched the pillow, the cubs stilled. Their growls faded into soft breaths. One by one, they curled at her side, their bodies pressing against her, their eyes closing. Within moments, the chaos dissolved into silence. The warriors froze, staring at the scene in disbelief. All their force, all their strength, had failed to control the cubs. Yet the moment she closed her eyes, the cubs surrendered to peace. The truth was undeniable. The commander's pride wavered. They wanted to shout, to call it trickery, to say the cubs were weak. But the evidence lay before them. Beasts that had never obeyed whips, chains, or shouted orders had chosen her calm as their law. The barracks grew quiet, every warrior watching the still figures on the ground. Some felt unease crawl through their chests. Others felt something, close to respect, though they would never admit it aloud. For the first time, they recognized that authority did not always come from power. Sometimes it came from presence, from the ability to inspire trust instead of fear. The woman did not gloat. She did not lift her head to meet their stares or claim victory. She remained as she always was, gentle, quiet, steady. Her silence was stronger than their rage. That night the test ended not with commands or punishment, but with recognition. The warriors, once doubting, had seen it with their own eyes. Her calm presence held a rule stronger than chains, stronger than shouted orders, stronger even than fear. And though no one spoke it aloud, a shift had begun in their hearts. The cubs had proven their loyalty was unbreakable, and through them, the woman had proven something greater. That authority could be reshaped, not by force, but by trust. From that night onward, the barracks carried a new kind of silence when she walked through. Not silence of fear, but of acknowledgement. She had passed the commander's test without lifting a hand, and the cubs had written her victory in their refusal. It was a lesson the warriors would not soon forget. The barracks were never the same after that night. What once echoed with sharp orders, clattering weapons, and restless growls now carried a different kind of sound. Soft breaths, low murmurs, and an unusual calm that spread like a blanket over everyone inside. The change had not come from new rules or stronger commanders. It had come from something far simpler, something no one had expected, the quiet presence of a single human woman. Each evening when the day's noise began to settle, all eyes would eventually drift toward her corner. The cubs, once wild and untamable, had made their choice clear. They waited for her, circling close, sometimes nudging her gently as if to remind her of their need. The warriors, though they still held their pride, could not deny what they saw. When she prepared to sleep, the entire barracks shifted with her. The lights, once kept bright through the night to show control, now dimmed. At first, it was only the cubs' behavior that demanded it. They refused to rest in the glare, their eyes always turning toward her in search of quiet. But soon, the warriors followed, lowering the flames, softening the glow, until darkness and peace replaced the old chaos. What began as an accident became a ritual, and before long no one questioned it. The change ran deeper than anyone had expected. Warriors who once barked commands now found themselves lowering their voices as evening approached. Even the harshest among them began to soften when the cubs curled at her side. The human had never asked for it, never demanded obedience. Yet the entire barracks fell into rhythm with her breaths, her stillness, her simple way of being. It was not weakness, though some had whispered it in the beginning. It was strength, of a different kind, one that could not be broken by shouting, nor bent by fear. The cubs had proven that they would not rest without her, and the warriors, in their silence, had proven that they too had accepted her presence as law. She had become a rule not written in command but carved into habit, into trust. Stories began to leave the barracks. At first they traveled in low voices, carried by those who had witnessed the strange transformation. But soon, the tales spread beyond the camp, drifting into nearby settlements, and then further still. They spoke of a human who tamed predators, not with chains, but with kindness. They spoke of cubs who once defied every order but bowed their heads at the calm of her smile. They spoke of warriors, hardened and unbending, who now dimmed their lights when she slept, following her as if she were their true commander. The story carried weight because it defied everything people thought they knew. Power had always been tied to dominance, to control, to fear. Yet here was proof that another path existed, that even the fiercest obeyed not out of force but out of choice. That trust, once given, held stronger than chains. In the barracks, the woman lived simply, never seeking the role she had taken. She still swept the floors, still carried water, still performed the duties given to her as a servant. But no one, could deny that she had become something more. When she walked through the halls, the cubs padded behind her, their paws silent but their presence loud. Warriors stepped aside without realizing it, their heads dipping, their voices dropping. Respect had grown naturally, not from rank or fear, but from what they had seen with their own eyes. At night, when the flames lowered and the hall grew quiet, the bond was clearest. The cubs nestled against her, their breaths slow and steady, their eyes closed without worry. Around them, warriors shifted into their own rest, their bodies finally letting go of the day's weight. The once chaotic barracks had found a new rhythm, one that beat in time with her. For the elders and leaders outside the camp, the change stirred both unease and wonder. Some saw it as dangerous, that a human could hold such quiet power over, creatures meant to be weapons. Others saw it as a sign of something greater, a lesson waiting to be learned. Whichever way they judged, none could deny the truth of the story. The woman herself never spoke of what had happened. To her it was not a victory or a legend. It was simply life, an unspoken understanding between her and the cubs, and now between her and the warriors as well. She had offered nothing but patience and kindness, and somehow it had reshaped the air of an entire place. Over time, what began as whispers turned into legend. They called her the one who taught predators peace, the one whose presence could calm storms, the one who ruled without ruling. It was a story told to children, to warriors in training, even to leaders searching for answers in a world built on power. The lesson was clear. Strength could command obedience, but kindness could win loyalty. Fear could control for a moment, but trust could last forever. And so the barracks became a living example of that truth. The cubs, once wild, slept peacefully at her side. The warriors, once hardened, now dimmed their lights in quiet respect. The human woman, once a servant with no voice, had become a rule written in the hearts of those around her. What began with scratching claws at night had ended with a bond strong enough to change an entire hall. It was no longer just her story. It was theirs. A story of trust over fear, peace over chaos, and a reminder whispered across worlds. Even the strongest bow to genuine kindness.